Welcome back to On the Level. I'm Jeff Hutton. A couple years back, I rented a villa in Bali. A day or so after I checked in, a young man came around to collect. His crew were in charge of security in the area, and the owner lived in France and hadn't paid for a while, and, would I mind? He was asking for the equivalent of $5 for, let's face it, it's protection money. The police can't always be counted on, and these guys know what's coming and going. It's the best $5 I'll ever spend. It's an example of where the state might end and where freelancers, if you will, begin. Indonesia has a unique relationship with the underworld. The local toughs here are called Preman. They collect debts, they rough up rivals, and if you're a politician, they help organize rallies and stage protests or disrupt them. Young men come from remote parts of the country, coming to Jakarta to make a start in life. And they'll sometimes hit the Preman up for work as maybe security. In other words, Preman get their hands dirty. They are mostly unseen, and at the same time, they are everywhere. And back in June, the country got a reminder of its underworld. One of its best-known gangsters, John Kay, was arrested after a gruesome gangland killing. It was something one of the dumber characters in an Elmore Leonard novel might do. Kay is charged with shooting up his uncle's house in a gated community before running over one of his uncle's men with his car, in all this in broad daylight. This was all in retribution for unpaid debts and impugned honor of his family. He is also known as the Godfather of Jakarta, and he had been out on parole for only 6 months following his 2012 killing of steel magnate Harrington Tono. Well, this week we speak with Ian Wilson, anthropologist at Murdoch University in Western Australia, and author of, I'll take a deep breath here, The Politics of Protection Rackets in Post-New Order Indonesia, Coercive, Capital, Authority, and Street Politics. Ian is a devotee of Pancak Silat, the Indonesian martial art, has spent more than his fair share chatting at length with Preman, and has a unique insight of the limits of official power and the usefulness of the so-called entrepreneurs of violence. I love that term. Here's our interview from last week over Zoom. I started by asking him about the Preman's historical role in Indonesia. Well, I know that you object to the term underworld because we've spoken before. So I think you called it entrepreneurs of violence. Is that
yes.
Right?
Yeah.
The protection rackets, and these are of course informal, and they have a nodding appreciation or recognition from the government and police. All societies have some form of that, but Indonesia has a unique relationship with its thugs, dating back to pre-colonial times and their usage by the Dutch colonials. So I'm going to ask you now to give us a potted history of the Jagos and the Lascars and how they emerged to be Preman of today.
Okay, sure. Well, I mean, you mentioned that term, sort of entrepreneurs in violence, and if we look at political science, sort of one of the greats of theorists of state building and the analysis of how states formed, Charles Tilley, talked about the sort of veneer difference between the state and organized crime. And he talked about the main point of differentiation was legitimacy, and that the development of forms of legitimacy, either through the provision of services or in ideological terms, was, from his analysis, one of the key points of distinction between simply brute coercive force, the imposition of will, and what we would come to understand forms of modern statehood. So, I mean, in terms of the kind of analysis that I've done of this phenomenon in Indonesia, I've tried to kind of trace back from the normative associations we see today in Indonesia of Preman as thugs, as criminals, as equivalents to the mafia or Yakuza or other things. And I think there's a point in pursuing some of that kind of analysis, but a deeper level, going back into Indonesian history, and this is going back into the colonial times and even earlier, if you look at the ways in which authority has developed into forms of power, forms of social organization, this figure of the Jago, the one who's seen as holding a particular kind of power. It often could be charismatic power. It's overlaid with ideas of magic and mystical power. So it's a key part. And again, this is something I looked at in Indonesian martial arts culture, of invulnerability. The idea of possessing a kind of a magical power that makes you invulnerable to being stabbed. But in some respects, it's sort of almost a metaphorical concept of being a kind of a power unto oneself, and ideas of kind of charismatic leadership. So if we look at the sort of trajectories of modern Indonesian history, and the term Preman, which again is sort of a modern normative term used to describe everything from, a petty thug or a guy who's kind of extorting street vendors up to a kind of sophisticated organised crime figure. The term itself, and it's derived from Dutch, it comes from Preman, which means loosely free man. And in the context of Indonesia's pre-independence colonial history, the Preman were, in a sense, not freed slaves, but local agents, local jago often, local jawara is another term, local strongmen who had a kind of contractual arrangement with the colonial authorities, often in the context of organising labour. So they would use their authority, including, it might be their reputation for being, a hard ass, to put it in those terms, as a part of local systems of power. And this has been a really recurring pattern throughout modern Indonesian history. If we look at the forms of opposition that emerged to the Dutch colonial regime, you saw often ragtag bands of militias, laskars, they're referred to in Indonesian, often led by charismatic local strongmen who often intertwined at that stage proto-nationalistic ideas with their own kind of local regimes. They may have been extractive regimes where they would be paid protection money, a tax. And again, if you go back to Charles Tilley, I love kind of Charles Tilley's kind of bluntness about this, of the sort of the thin line between what we might see as criminality and legitimate forms of power, that there was a kind of an interplay between these in how post-independent forms of governance emerged in Indonesia.
Were they doing the colonials' dirty work? Were they the guys you went to collect taxes? I mean, how were they useful to the Dutch?
Well, if we look at pre-colonial Jakarta, Batavia, as the kind of hub of Dutch colonial power, in that context, local strongmen were essential in areas like Tanjung Priok, which is where the modern harbour of Jakarta is, in managing labour on the ground. When you ventured out of Batavia, and part of the interesting part of Indonesian colonial history was that the Dutch really struggled to sort of maintain an effective mode of governance throughout, the sprawling archipelago of Indonesia, that forming alliances or opportunistic relationships with these kinds of figures, in a sense, formed a kind of a network of power. They would exercise limited forms of control. And so you often saw, if you look at some of the great histories, people like Robert Cribb have written about this, a kind of an oscillation between local strongmen collaborating with the colonial authorities, but at the same time engaging in criminality that was arguably opposed to colonial interests at the same time. So they were local strongmen, men of influence. They had the capacity to organise others, to influence others, and that remains an important form of social and political capital that others in more formal institutions of power can see the value of.
Well, fast forward in a second. I just want to establish that their uses and the basis in Indonesian society. I would imagine that if you've got these powerful Jago and Preman, that they would be a bit of a threat to the new republic, and it would be a bit of an effort to disarm them and bring them to heel. Was Sukarno a smart in using them and getting them and subcontracting the use of subcontracting them to exert influence and power over the country?
Well, I mean, if you look at sort of broader literature that looks at how, for example, militaries form in post-revolutionary states. There's an interesting scholarship that looks at particular kinds of trends where a lot of revolutionary states that are formed out of opposition to colonial occupation, and the opposition didn't have a necessarily united front. And of course, Indonesian nationalist rhetoric is very powerful in presenting the kind of image of a unified response to colonialism. But the history suggests of course, it was much more fragmented, and you had a great task after the Dutch had formally relinquished their control over Indonesia to kind of control and organize all these disparate groups, these local warlords, these local bosses, who all had often very different ideas about what the new Indonesia would look like. And of course, that was one of the initial challenges of developing the Indonesian armed forces, of how you can integrate a variety of different elements into a functional armed force, what their purpose is, and what kind of relationship they have with the broader society. So from very early on, say into the 1950s, some of the early kind of leaders of the Indonesian post-independence armed forces, General Nasution, he was one of the architects of the idea of dui fungsi, of the dual function role of the Indonesian military, articulated very clear ideas about how different elements of society could be integrated into a broader notion of security. So the idea of Sisham Kamrata, which is a kind of one of those incredibly long Indonesian acronyms, was meant to articulate the idea that elements of civil society could be integrated in, not necessarily in a formal sense, but will be involved in a broader notion of maintaining social and political order. And this is where from very early on, local jago and Preman, as they're known now, were seen as having a key role.
So co-opting paramilitaries and organized crime into the edifices of the state. That was the idea, sort of blending them in.
In a sense, and it's always, again, a kind of a bit of a third arm arrangement. So you had from the 1950s, Pemuda Pancasila Youth, well known in Indonesia as a sort of a paramilitary organization. Many people think of the word Preman, they immediately think of Pemuda Pancasila. Well, Pemuda Pancasila's history is informative in that sense because General Nasution helped to establish it as part of the sort of ideological push and shove of the 1950s as a way of organizing local gangsters primarily, unemployed youth, marginalized working class youth into an organization that was part of the ideological tussles at that time. And at that time, it meant they were specifically anti-communist because the Indonesian Communist Party, of course, was very powerful in the 1950s and into the 1960s. So again, you had, I guess, another trend of elements of the Indonesian military trying to co-opt and organize these groups, as part of their own kind of machinations, I guess, for power. And if you look at the events of 1965, the violence of 1965, many of these kind of groups were at the forefront. Of course, Joshua Oppenheimer's amazing documentary looking at Pemuda Pancasila's role has revealed that to a greater audience. But that was a sort of a key pattern that you had of the military developing broader networks of these kind of, I guess, thugs, jago, local strongmen as part of a broader means of maintaining a particular kind of social and political order. And I think that's been a broader kind of pattern that's maintained itself into the present day.
The reason why I wanted to speak with you was for the very first time, I've been here for 8 years, and the story of John Kay came up and burst onto the scene in June when he was, and just for the listener who may not know about Indonesian thuggery, he is a local tough who had a very storied career. He bragged that his first murder was in the early 1990s when he was a teenager, and he was in jail for the 2012 murder. He was out on bail, but because of he had a bit of a dust up with his uncle, K, right? Mm-hmm. The uncle owed him quite a bit of money and was apparently lobbing insults and harassing the family. So John and a cohort of a couple dozen of his cadre got into cars and went and shot up Noose's house and killed one, or was it two, of his henchmen.
Yeah.
He's now back in jail. I'm wondering how that episode, which was all over the headlines, was made national news. How does that sit with this idea of Preman, with this storied history, their role in independence, their role in colonial times, their role in the Order Baru? Does John Kay come across as a figure from another time? I was curious about how you think that sat with the Indonesian public.
Sure. I mean, I think the recent episode, where he was released from jail very prematurely, and I'm not quite sure how to explain why he was able to get off so many years off his sentence for a very serious.
He was in Nusa Kambangan, right? He was in he wasn't on death row for some reason, but
no, he had, as I understand it, 16-year sentence for murder, and was released over 7 years early. From what I could ascertain from sort of media reports, he'd gotten a good word from influential people that had convinced the responsible minister to give him an early release. I mean, going back to the sort of, I guess there was quite a bit of sensation around what happened. And I think that's maybe a positive thing insofar as for Indonesians now, that kind of thing is, in a sense, not as common an occurrence as it used to be. And John Kay, looking at it, and he's someone who I had come across in sort of earlier years of my research. And if anyone knows Jalan Jaksa in Jakarta, which used to be a sort of a thriving hub of, cheap bars and all the rest of it, that used to be his haunt, certainly in the early.
Oh, really? That's where the backpackers go before they go to Bali.
That's right. And he owned one small hotel there, and his network was extremely influential in that area for a particular period of time. I mean, he's sort of an old school figure insofar as, and if I just backtrack into history a little bit into the New Order, you saw, the New Order regime seeking to consolidate itself and to try and control a whole range of what it saw as both useful but challenging elements of society. And there was a particular emphasis upon, the so-called Preman or Jago figure as both a potential source of lawlessness and disorder, but also as key partners in maintaining the interests of the New Order. And this sort of relationship was sort of summarized in a word, which is in Indonesian backing, which is essentially an Indonesianization of backing. Where you would have localized arrangements, but they were so common as to also almost be a kind of a semi-institutional arrangement, where you would have local figures. John Kay's, someone who I've written about a lot is Hercules, from East Timorese gangster who came to Jakarta in the early 1990s, where they would essentially operate protection racket regimes, criminal enterprises of sorts, and they'd be able to do this with the tacit approval of people within the military and within the regime. Now, this understanding was based on a couple of considerations. One was that there would be a kind of a train of profit distribution up a hierarchy, where local level extortion and protection racket regimes would see payoffs to officials, military officials, so everyone was essentially benefiting economically from these arrangements. And also that these figures and groups would be at hand to what I refer to as sort of perform regime maintenance chores. What does that mean? Well, in the 1990s, it meant that gangsters would be involved in harassing or intimidating activists. Hercules, who's from East Timor, had a particular use value to intimidate pro-independence East Timorese. And John Kay was similarly involved in sort of low-level political thuggery. which made him a useful figure. And again, Pemuda Pancasila, in a sense, institutionalized this kind of arrangement of being involved in racketeering and extractive regimes, getting preferential contracts through government networks, and also performing this sort of coercive ideological role as ultranationalists. And again, in the current age we're in, far-right ultranationalists are sort of everywhere, but Pemuda Pancasila is sort of a grandfather of that. This ideological role. I mean, you don't see socially progressive groups adopting this form in Indonesia, and there's a reason for that.
No.
Because they've emerged out of a very reactionary kind of political formation. And that's what I refer, my work, I talk about racketeering regimes in this sense.
So the Preman seems to me to play a role, certainly then, if not now, of collecting the money, keeping order, and putting out fires. Doing the dirty work on behalf of the legitimate government.
Well, I mean, I would say what's so interesting about Preman, not just as a kind of a particular figure of criminality, is that the term really encapsulates the idea of criminality and state power converging and intersecting with one another. And I think that's what, to me, sort of, I guess intellectually, but in terms of my research, has been one of the things that's been so fascinating about Preman, is it's not just about dealing with criminality, but looking at the ways in which criminality and state power intersect and reflect one another. And I think Preman as a concept, and I think, if you looked at the 1960s and 70s in Indonesian colloquial language, Preman was often used to refer, and it's still occasionally I hear this when I'm in, maybe not Jakarta, but other parts of the country. If you say someone is, to use the Indonesian, berpakaian preman, they're in their preman clothes, it's an old term for a military person being in their civilian clothes. In your civvies would be the term that we'd use in Australia. And I mean, that's sort of indicative of the ambiguity of the concept, where it represents at one level formal authority out of uniform. And if you look at the fact that Pemuda Pancasila and other groups actually often reproduce militaristic aesthetics in their camouflage, it makes more sense that there's this kind of interplay between forms of informal and formal authority, legitimate power and criminal power, and all of these contradictions and ambiguities are kind of embodied in the concept of the Preman itself. And I think that's why sort of during the New Order regime, there was a very clear pro-regime element to these groups. And you saw when, say, the 1980s, when there was a perception that some of these groups were getting a bit too big for their boots from the regime's point of view, the state using brutal force. You saw the Petrus killings of that period where petty gangsters were targeted and for extrajudicial killing as a message to these groups that ultimately the big boss was the state, and that they could only operate their small-scale regimes with the consent of, if you want to use that analogy, the mafia don, which was Suharto himself. So was always been that pyramidic relationship. But the post-New Order period's become a bit more complicated, and groups act autonomously. Of course, the political environment is much more complex and fragmented. And also you have manifestations of it. And this has been something that's been really of great interest to me, where the same kind of ideas of local authority have translated in some respects to new forms of popular democratic engagement. So some of the ormas, the social organizations that I've looked at in Jakarta, like the Forum Betawi Rempug, which is one of the post-98 groups that emerged in Jakarta, uses the aesthetics of the Jago. It's been involved in low-level, I guess you could say, protective racket regimes, but it has a discourse which has spoke to imbalances of power. So they claim to represent the indigenous population of Jakarta, the Betawi, arguing that they were being displaced, marginalised in their own homelands by the hyper-capitalisation of Jakarta itself, and that the organisation is a way of asserting their rights to a piece of the pie. Now, in practice, that may have translated at times into criminal behaviour, But, spending a lot of time with them over the years, I don't actually doubt the sincerity of many of those involved who see that formation, that way of approaching things, as a way of asserting what they see as their rights.
Right, that narrative that gives them legitimacy and the broader public's view. And we have to remember that they don't exist in a vacuum. I mean, there is some tacit approval by the populace in general. I want to get back to what you were saying. I really like this, the intersection of criminality and state power. And I think probably the story of Hercules, great name. Is that his actual name, Hercules?
No, it's not his actual name, but it's a nickname that was given to him.
Fantastic nickname.
It is.
In his relationship with Prabowo Subianto, the two-time presidential candidate and current defense minister, and former son-in-law of Suharto. He has a sad trajectory. I wonder if you could tell us about it, as this is a really good way of sort of exemplifying this modality that you're talking about. Sure.
Well, I mean, Hercules' story is sort of, I mean, for me, it always has a sort of a tragic dimension to it. He is East Timorese. He was orphaned quite young. There's different stories that circulate, and it's often, as a researcher, difficult to disentangle the kind of myths that have built up over time around some of these figures and what actually transpired. But his parents died as an outcome of Indonesia's invasion of East Timor. He was left with many other young East Timorese, essentially orphaned, and he was drawn into the networks of the Indonesian occupying military force. And him and a number of others were involved in assisting the Indonesian military in transporting. He in particular was involved in guarding storehouses for supplies, and also involved in transporting ammunition to different military divisions. And through that process, he was informally adopted by some senior military officers. And again, this was sort of part of a broader sort of process of drawing in these kinds of, in a sense, victims of Indonesia's military occupation, drawing in them into the networks of the Indonesian military itself. Now, in Hercules' story, he was brought to Jakarta in the late 1980s, and this was at a time when international concern over Indonesia's occupation and of East Timor and its treatment, the vast human rights abuses in East Timor, was getting more international attention. And the Suharto family, in particular Tutut Suharto, his eldest daughter, had a foundation, the so-called Yayasan, which was meant to be a kind of an outreach program. And it was essentially a kind of state propaganda to try and show that actually Indonesia was uplifting the circumstances of the East Timorese, and that their occupation was ultimately a kind of beneficial and benevolent act. And part of this was that they brought a number of East Timorese youth, including Hercules and those of his kind of group. I don't know if you call it a gang, but it's sort of his associates, to Jakarta. And they were provided with jobs in manufacturing plants in Jakarta. This didn't suit them. They'd kind of had a rough life already. They had close networks, relationships with some senior figures in the military, including Prabowo, who was, of course, very active in East Timor, and he was very involved in, I guess, applying that military logic of establishing militia, of establishing martial arts groups as a means of integrating elements of society within, the kind of military control structures. He ended up in Tanah Abang, which, for those who don't know, Jakarta is one of the largest textile markets in Southeast Asia, a complex place, lots of, a thriving cash economy. And him and his group, they'd all been brought over as part of this process, established a name for themselves as a gang that would impose protection upon local traders. So they basically formed a kind of a protection racket regime. Part of their capacity to do this as outsiders in Jakarta, and Jakarta's got very well-established players, was that they had a well-known relationship to the military, and in particular Prabowo. So during the 1990s, this relationship consolidated, And Hercules Group, whilst making, I guess, a kind of a mini protection racket empire for themselves in Tanah Abang, also performed very crucial political tasks on behalf of Prabowo specifically. And this was in the context of, the increasingly open support for East Timorese independence, both within East Timor and outside of East Timor. And Hercules, as being East Timorese, had a particular kind of supposedly social capital in organising counter-protests, so pro-government protests led by an East Timorese, but also the intimidation and harassment of activists and East Timorese students, particularly those who are in Jakarta, who were known to be even openly or quietly supportive of East Timorese independence. So he performed this political role, which intertwined with support for his, I guess, criminal regime in Tanah Abang, and helped keep at bay a whole array of challenges. There were many people who wanted to monopolise sort of protection racketeering in Tanah Abang. There's a lot of money to be made, and there's still a lot of jostling in that place to this day. He was able to establish himself in that way.
Thanks to his patronage, his patron,
yes.
Prabowo, right? And he was injured too. He was blind in one eye, wasn't he? Because
he sustained a number of injuries, both in East Timor and out of East Timor. He lost an eye in being caught up in conflict in East Timor, and he also lost a hand in another accident, which there's a sort of a myth that was built around how that happened, but the most reliable source, he was involved actually in a helicopter crash in East Timor, which saw him severely injured. So he's quite a figure, with a fake eye, which I can say as an interviewer, it's quite unsettling because, of course, you don't really know whether he's looking at you or not, and he has a gloved wooden hand. And so he established himself because of this tacit sort of support of military figures, particularly Prabowo. But we saw, sort of fast forwarding a bit, this started to unravel in the 1990s within his own gang, which consisted of mainly East Timorese, but also other East Indonesians from Flores, Sumbawa. There were those who were uncomfortable with their political role. They had families in East Timor. They had friends and relatives who had died or suffered as a result of the occupation. And there was a particular case, and I talk about it in quite a lot of detail in my book, of one of his senior members of his gang who basically refused to be involved in these activities anymore. He wasn't able to openly support Indonesia's position on East Timor in the same way. He ended up dying. He was actually shot in what was claimed to be a robbery gone wrong, but which many believed was that he was essentially executed. And this unraveled Hercules' kind of usability for mobilization in that sense. So from Prabowo's point of view, and Prabowo was sort of, in some respects, the intellectual architect of a lot of these ideas, the sort of reinterpretation of these ideas of total people's security and of integrating elements of society via militias, via hyper-nationalist programs. And we're seeing this now in his role as Minister of Defence, where he's revived the idea of sort of auxiliary troops and of the Bela Negara program. Hercules was of no longer of any use to him. So he essentially abandoned him to his fate, which at that time meant that other players in the Tanah Abang scene, gangsters with Betawi, Maduranese, mainly ethnically organised groups, made their move, and he was deposed with, from what I could ascertain from researching this, sort of the tacit support of the military, who enabled him to be removed from that position because he was of no use to Prabowo in that sense. He came back again he's a grand survivor, and I think his name is actually probably, Hercules is a fitting name for him because he's showed incredible resilience and survivability through these times. When Prabowo's political aspirations sort of consolidated in the kind of late 2000s, firstly with his vice presidential run with Megawati, and then when he decided he had his eyes on the prize of the presidency, Hercules was called on again to perform this particular kind of role. And he was established at that time with the support of Prabowo and his political party, Gerindra, a group called GRIB, Gerakan Rakyat for Untuk Indonesia Baru. And this was a social organization. And again, this speaks to that dynamic. I mean, it was argued that it was an independent organization organically emerging from society, because anyone who observed it knew that that was complete rubbish. It was established by Prabowo to serve a very specific political purpose. And Hercules' sort of name and the fact that he's highly respected in many elements of society, or respected - feared, he was tasked with organizing networks of local gangsters, of local groups into a broader coalition that will be part of Prabowo's campaign vehicle. And so in the first presidential campaign, Hercules was mobilized in that way. Of course, for Prabowo, he ultimately lost the election. And again, Hercules got caught up in other acts of criminality. The police in Jakarta were extremely uneasy about his sort of re-emergence into the scene with Prabowo support. The world had changed a lot in terms of the constellations of power at the local level. And there was a very concerted campaign by the Indonesian or the Jakarta police to get Hercules in jail, and he did. And just as Prabowo had done in the 1990s, when Hercules was no longer of political value to him, he essentially was hands off. In the 1990s, I have the news clippings from the time, he basically said, "I've never heard of this guy before," which of course was a lie. And more recently, he basically said that, that Hercules was operating largely independently and he wasn't involved in what he was doing. So this spoke to this pattern of using these figures for particular political projects. And then I guess the cruel fate of the Preman is that when they're not of use to those in power, they'll essentially be abandoned. What might have changed a bit now is the nature of decentralized politics in Indonesia. Of course, many people with these kinds of backgrounds don't have to rely on other elites. They can forge their own political path. And if you look at, parts of the country, Medan, which has had a very well-established kind of Preman scene, there's been a strong transition of people who've been able to get elected into power. Their Preman background is a political asset for their own aspirations to gain formal authority.
I wanted to ask you about that. The role of Preman is pretty clear in the Suharto Sukarno era, and it sort of sits uncomfortably with the image of the modern democratic Indonesia, and yet, a country that is trying to invest a lot in infrastructure and services, and at least pays lip service to professionalizing the police, and at the very least has put the military back into the barracks formally, although there's been some reemergence in that front too. But still, there is very much an image of Indonesia being democratic and modern. But on the other hand, it seems to be more avenues for usage of these organized groups, these entrepreneurs of violence, in the democratic Indonesia, with political parties more than ever needing someone to hit the pavement and mobilize for them, to keep protesters at bay, to keep their fingers on the pulse of their neighborhoods. If anything, there's a new role. There's more of a role for Preman now than there were. I would have thought it would fade away, but the explosion of John Key back into the headlines, and we're talking about Prabowo, and this is a guy who almost certainly is going to run again. They're not going anywhere, are they? The roles are morphing. They are a partner of democracy, of the democratic parties.
Well, I mean, I think one thing that's interesting in looking at this phenomenon, it's why I've become, I guess, more reticent to use Preman to describe these kinds of groups, because you can look at an organization like the Forum Betawi Rempuk. You can even look at an organization like Front Pembela Islam, which of course many people have very strong opinions at. And their history is an interesting one because they emerged out of that same kind of pattern where they were established by military figures as a third armed force, reactionary force against progressive social forces. At that time, it was the student movement. But in the context of Indonesia's post-New Order democracy, decentralized democracy, they've become their own political force in a sense. And arguably, I know a lot of my Indonesian sort of NGO friends kind of balk at this when I tell them. I think there are elements of genuine representation in those groups. So if you have somewhere like the Forum Betawi Rempog, which, and I can't not talk about this and talk about social class. So they come from primarily working class backgrounds. And a lot of the discourse of these is essentially criminal organizations. You'll see very strong amongst middle-class Indonesians. But if you go to the neighborhoods where these groups are often very strong, they perform a whole array of services, of modes of representation that are needed or wanted by people. So the FBR, for example, has unemployed graduates from law degrees who provide legal aid advice to the communities in which they're based. The organisation has ambulances. It has connections to industry where it forces its hand to get members employed in, say, if you look at the kind of manufacturing areas in Bekasi and Tangerang. The flip side is that older relationship where they are often deployed at the same time, this arrangement, you will employ your guys, you have to help us to suppress union organising. So they still perform that reactionary political role. But there is nonetheless modes of representation, and people often look to these groups just in the way that the Jago has often been a kind of formed a brokering role between local communities and formal power. These organisations often have degrees of representation and providing services that people want and need in lieu of them being offered by the state. And when it comes to political electoral contestation, in the context of Indonesia, where political parties don't have strong grassroots foundations for the most part, these kind of organisations often form also a brokering kind of role to particular constituencies, either to mobilise them for electoral purposes, to mobilise them to support a campaign around particular ideas, or in that older sense, as a kind of reactionary force to go on the attack against other groups or other social forces. And so it's a much more complex arrangement now. I think, John Kay, in a sense, is from a different space. He's a debt collector, clearly involved in more nefarious forms of criminality. And when I saw what he did when he came out and, they were involved in this, these killings and these very public attacks, was that he completely lost track of how much Indonesia had changed, probably in the time that he'd been in prison. And there's a much more complex set of arrangements now. And, whilst Preman might be used to describe a group like Pemuda Pancasila and FBR still today, the reality is that their demographic is much broader than that. And I think you're seeing a more complex mix of the kinds of thuggish behaviour that many people associate with those groups, but also, new kinds of people being attracted in. I know from Pemuda Pancasila that during the last election, they saw a big influx of university students, middle-class members, not because they're interested in criminality, but because they were genuinely anxious about what Islamists may be politically influential in the election via Prabowo. So the kind of hardcore pro-Pancasila rhetoric was seen by some as a comforting discursive frame against, as a kind of a defender of an idea of Indonesian pluralism. So the clever groups have been able to negotiate this space in different ways.
This is really interesting because the way I've seen this whole space is that it just reflects the limitations of the institutions and of government services, that they're almost sort of like weeds growing through the cracks, that they just sprout up in places where the government can't reach, or that a corrupt police allow to take root. But is that still a fair assessment of them, or are they becoming more They sound like they're becoming more sophisticated.
Oh, there's definitely much more sophistication than is often attributed to these groups. I think some of what you said still holds, where, you know, these are organisations that make an effort to reach out to demographics, you know, particularly in a country like Indonesia, in a city like Jakarta, where you have large numbers of young people, lower middle class to poor backgrounds, who don't have social mobility. They don't necessarily see, how am I going to negotiate this situation to improve my lot? And these groups often are very adept at providing not just an explanation for things, but also networks of opportunity, a means of getting a job, a means of modes of security and protection by having a network who will support you. And this has sort of been one thing I've talked about, the franchise system, where, you know, groups like Pemuda Pancasila and FBR have franchised their name to local constellations of young people or local jago, who use the name in their own contestations. So this has become a really popular kind of model, but at the same time, you're seeing also appeals to a middle class. So FPE, through the whole Ahok blasphemy kind of saga, was able to attract a new demographic of middle-class, pious Muslim Indonesians who now see Habib Rizik as a genuine religious leader, and arguably he is, whether you like him or not. Pemuda Pancasila was able to represent themselves in the context of a polarized election as a defender of Indonesian pluralism vis-a-vis the Pancasila, in the face of what many were fearing as a kind of fundamentalist Islamic surge. And so both of these things drew in new demographics to these groups, bringing with them their own economic interests, their own networks, in ways that has expanded the influence of these groups. I mean, I would say Pemuda Pancasila now is probably at the peak of its power. It has, its deputy chair is very influential. I always forget his long name, Bamsot. He's the head of Indonesia's parliament from Golkar. They're very close relationships with the Jokowi administration, and sort of reshaping themselves in ways where just calling them Preman groups anymore just really isn't capturing the sophistication and the breadth of what they're engaged with. So,
not your father's Preman.
No, but those people still exist, and they still have their political role to play. But again, returning to John Kay, I mean, it seemed a bit of, I don't know if it would be extreme to say sympathy, but I looked at it and sort of, there's a bit of a cringe where it's like, man, you just don't see how things are being played nowadays, where he goes in guns blazing, of course, forgetting that everyone has a mobile phone, everyone's recorded it.
That's right. There's cameras everywhere.
It seemed like something from another era where he just was out of touch with what's going on. The sophisticated players, like Pemuda Pancasila, you know, they're not necessarily committed to a particular way of doing things. They want to further their interests, and that involves adaptation, and it involves being a bit more sophisticated than simply, you know, involved in sort of thuggish behavior. And the groups that have thrived and continue to thrive have shown themselves to be very flexible in that respect.
How do you get this information? How do you get the organized crime, the Preman, the underworld types to open up to you? You don't look like you smoke.
I'm a reformed Kretek smoker. I smoked Jarum Samsu for way too long, but certainly, one of the things I guess I love about being in Jakarta is nongkrong culture of hanging out, which, coming from an anthropological background, you know, hanging out and fieldwork are kind of, in a sense, one and the same. And so one of the things I've enjoyed about this kind of work, and I think it has an important aspect to it, is, you know, we see Preman talked about, and we've seen Indonesian history as a very dehumanizing term that's been used to rationalize extrajudicial killings by the police, etc. And one thing that I've learned, and I think that's something that I hope is reflected in some of my work, is rehumanizing the Preman subject, that we have stories of disenfranchisement, of people feeling disempowered, of deep hopelessness, particularly coming out of poor and working class backgrounds. And that helps to explain why these groups have remained also in a post-authoritarian Indonesia, even though one has quite worrying. I have some worries as to what direction it's heading at the moment, but nonetheless, post-authoritarian, these groups continue to attract young people to them. I mean, hanging out with people, hearing their stories, and just listening. It was very easy to develop relationships with people. I wasn't there to judge people. I want to understand why they do what they do, why they think, how they came to be where they are. I think that's the standard ethical research practice. And so, yeah, that's sort of one of the parts I've really enjoyed about it. And I've got to, sort of, it's a few years back now, but when I was doing quite a lot of work in that space, getting to form, genuine relationships with people and understanding how they came to be the way they are. And I think that's what we should be doing as social researchers. And it's also made me very critical of some of the discourses I see in Indonesian media, where there's a kind of a quickness to dehumanize people by calling them Preman. And often you'll see in some media, Preman is really a euphemism for working class or poor in some respects, where people are trying to forge lives for themselves in different circumstances. And, you have to be wary of how the term is used in that context. And I've come to be very, I guess, sensitive to that over the years, that it can be a very powerful dehumanizing term. To borrow a cliche from, from the security studies and terrorism studies, say one person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. Well, one person's Preman is another person's freedom fighter as well. That there's sort of this often, these same figures can be seen by different constituents and different social classes as in fact their champion. The word juggle reflects that more clearly, as someone who will stand up for them, who will represent them in a system where if you don't have connections, life can be very hard, and you'll be denied basic rights and basic services.
They wouldn't exist if there wasn't a need.
That's right. And even a John Kay, who made his riches as a debt collector. Well, debt collection is a particular world in and of itself, but one of the reasons debt collection is so prevalent is because of, the poor regulatory environment for the resolution of contract problems, etc. It's opened a market, and the same middle class who often bemoan Preman as a social menace that should be wiped out are often, and I know this for a fact, the ones who will hire a John Kay or others to resolve their business dispute. So, there's a problem of, just basic governance issues where there continues to be a market demand for the services that some of these figures and groups provide.
I didn't think about that until now, the extent to which they're exploited and then disposed of. Mm. Yeah. Well, thank you very much for talking with me. We've only just scratched the surface. And I just want to mention your book. I've got it here on my iPad. It is The Politics of Protection Rackets in Post-New Order Indonesia.
Yep. Can I also plug that there's a Indonesian translation of it?
Oh, yeah?
Which is also a lot cheaper, called Politik Jatah Preman. It's published by Majan Kiri, who are a fantastic Indonesian publisher. So for Indonesian language readers, it's available in Indonesian, and it's also a lot cheaper in Indonesian as well.
Ian, thanks so much for joining me.
It's my pleasure, Jeff.
All right, bye.
Bye-bye.
And that's our program. Thanks to Ian Wilson. As always, our producer is Stephen Handoko. Research by Imam Shofo. Music by Soundstripe. If you like us, please rate us. And you can reach us on Instagram at onthelevel_podcast. I'm Jeff Hutton. Bye for now.